Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, everyone, we are from second group in Comparative Linguistic subject, and our topic today is about historical comparative linguistic in 19th century. And our members are Lulu Latifah, Melati Malianti, Laras Saraswati, Agil Nofri Azmi, Mochamad Fauzan, Farhan nasrussyfa, Ariyanto, Mochamad Dzulkifli Faisal, Firhan mawardi, Tazkia izzah, Tsabitah alifa, and Refa triana. And then next to the first material.
The history of comparative linguistics is divided by three. The first era is the end of the 18th century up to the middle of the 19th century, which is called the beginning of comparative research. The second one is the end of the 19th century, the period of neo-grammarian studies when linguists start comparing living language. And finally, the third one, the beginning of the 20th century up to the present, the period of structural and functional approaches to language. It is generally agreed that the most outstanding achievement of linguistic scholarship in the 19th century was the development of comparative method, which comprised a set of principles whereby languages could be systematically compared with respect to their sound systems, grammatical structure, and vocabulary, and shown to be genealogically related, as French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, and the other Romance languages had evolved from Latin, so Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and as well as the Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic languages, and many other of Europe and Asia, had evolved from some earlier language, to which the name Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European is now customarily applied.
The end of 18th up to early 19th. The main impetus for the development of comparative philology came toward the end of 18th century, when it was discovered that Sanskrit bore a number of striking resemblances to Greek and Latin. An English Orientalist, Sir William Jones, thought he was not the first to observe these resemblances, is generally given the credit for bringing them to the attention of the scholarly world and putting forward the hypothesis in 1786 that all three languages must have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. By this time, a number of texts and glossaries of the older Germanic language, Gothic, Old School German, and Old Norse, had been published, and Jones realized that Germanic as well as Old Persian and perhaps Celtic had evolved from the same common source. The next important step came in 1822, when the German scholar Jacob Grimm, following the Danish linguist Rasmus Rask, whose work being written in Danish, when less accessible to most European scholars, pointed out in the second edition of this comparative grammar of Germanic that three were a number of systematic correspondence between the sound of Germanic and the sounds of Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit in related words. Grimm note, for example, that word Gothic, the oldest surviving Germanic language, had an F. Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit frequently had AP. Example: Gothic foetus, Latin pedis, Greek podos, Sanskrit padas, all meaning foot. When Gothic had AP, the non-Germanic language had AB. When Gothic had AB, the non-Germanic language had what Grimm called an aspirate, Latin F, Greek BH, Sanskrit BH. In order to account for this correspondence, he postulated as a cycle sonship, Laut vers Hebung, In the prehistory of Germanic, in which the original aspirates became voiced, unaspirated stop bh became b-atc. The original voiced unaspirated stop become voiceless b became p-atc, and the original voices unaspirated stops became aspirates. P became F. Grimm's term aspirate. It will be not covered such phonetically distinct category as aspirated stops (bh) produced with accompanying audible puff of breath and fricatives f produced by audible friction as a result of incomplete closure in the vocal tract.
Okay, next. In the work of the next 50 years, the idea of sound change was made more precise, and in the 1870s, a group of scholars known collectively as the Young Grammarians or Neo-Grammarians, put forward the thesis that all change in the sound system of a language as it developed through time were subject to the operation of the regular sound law. Taught the thesis that sound laws were absolutely regular in their operation, unless they were inhibited in particular instance by the influence of analogy, was at first regarded as most controversial. By the end of the 19th century, it was quite generally accepted and has become the cornerstone of the comparative method. Using the principle of regular sound change, scholars were able to reconstruct ancestral common forms from which the later forms found in a particular language could be derived. By convention, such reconstruct forms are marked in the literature with an asterisk. Thus, forms the reconstructed Proto-Indo-Europa word 410. It was possible to derive Sanskrit dasa, Greek deka, Latin decim, and Gothic Chayun by postulating a number of different sounds law that operated independently in the different branches of the Indo-European family. The questions of sound change is dealt with in greater detail in the sections entitled Historical Diachronic Linguistic.
Analogy has been mentioned in connection with its inhibition of the regular operation of sound laws in particular word forms. This was how the new grammarians thought of it. In the course of the 20th century, however, it came to be recognized that analogy, taken in its most general sense, plays a far more important role in the development of languages than simply that of sporadically preventing what would otherwise be a completely regular transformation of the sound system of a language. When a child learns to speak, he tends to regularize the anomalous or irregular forms by analogy with the more regular and productive patterns of formation in the language. Example, he will tend to say comed rather than came, dived rather than dove, and so on, just as he will say talk, loved, and so forth. The fact that the child does this is evidenced that he has learned or is learning the regularities or rules of his language. He will go on to unlearn some of the analogical forms and substitute for them the anomalous forms current in the speech of the previous generation. But in some cases, he will keep a new analogical form, and this may then become the recognized and accepted form.
Hi, I'm Melati. Here I want to explain about 19th century theories and development. One of the most original, if not one of the most immediately influential linguist of the 19th century was the learned Persian statesman Wilhelm. His interests, unlike those of most of his contemporaries, were not exclusively historical following the German philosopher Johann. He stressed the connection between national language and national character. This was but a commonplace of Romanticism. More original was Humboldt's theory of inner and outer. Inner and outer form in language. The outer form of language was the raw material or the sound from which different languages were fashioned. The inner form was the pattern or the structure or grammar and meaning that was imposed upon this raw material and differentiated one language from another. The structure concept of language was to become dominant for a time at least in many of the major centers of linguistics by the middle of the 20th century. Another of Humboldt's ideas was the language was something dynamic rather than static and was an activity itself rather than the product of the activities. A language was not a set of actual utterance product by speaker, but the underlying principle or rules that made it possible for speaker to produce such utterance and moreover an unlimited number of them. This idea was taken up by a German philologist, and what is more important, by the philologist Wilhelm, and thus influenced late 19th and early 20th century theories of the philosophy of language. Its influence, like that of the distinction of inner and outer form, can also be seen in the thought of Ferdinand Saussure, a Swiss linguist, but its full implication were probably not perceived and made precise until the middle of the 20th century, when the U.S. linguist Noam re-emphasized it and made it one of the basic notions of generative grammar. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Fauzan. Now I'm going to discuss about phonetics and dialectology. Many other interesting and important developments occurred in 19th century linguistic research. Among them work in the areas of phonetics and dialectology. Research in both these fields was promoted by the neo-grammarians concerned with sound change and by their insistence that prehistoric developments in languages were of the same kind as developments taking place in the languages and dialects currently spoken. The development of phonetics in the West was also strongly influenced at this period. as were many of the details of the more philological analysis of the Indo-European languages by the discovery of the works of the Indian grammarians who, from the time of the Sanskrit grammarian Panini, if not before, had arrived at a much more comprehensive and scientific theory of phonetics, phonology, and morphology than anything achieved in the West until the modern period. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.